What if I told you Rome's greatest victory wasn't won on the battlefield, but in the silence that followed? Not in the clash of swords, but in the 3 days when 23,000 soldiers waited outside a city already doomed. Corinth did not fall in chaos, it fell in calculation. And when the gates finally opened, Rome didn't just destroy buildings, it dismantled lives with terrifying precision. This is not just the story of a conquered city, it is the story of the women history barely recorded, wives of councilmen, daughters raised in gold and ceremony, priestesses who once stood atop the Corinth, invoking gods older than Rome itself. In a single week, they went from power and privilege to wooden tags around their necks, standing beneath a spear planted in the dirt, waiting for strangers to decide their price. But here is what makes this story darker than most. Rome did not act in rage. It acted with system, with policy, with profit in mind. Mothers were separated from children, not by cruelty alone, but by market logic. Temple servants were not punished for faith, they were reclassified as skilled assets. And a city that once controlled 2 seas was broken down into units of resale value. What happened next did not end at Corinth's burning walls. It spread across the Mediterranean, to Delos, to Rome, into villas, temples, and aristocratic homes. And in a twist no one at the Triumph Parade could see coming, the very culture Rome tried to crush began reshaping the empire from within. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end with chains. It ends with a question that still haunts every empire that believes it is untouchable. What happens when victory goes too far? Kings were killed. Queens were broken, but some stories refuse to die. If you crave real dark history, like, subscribe, and don't look away. The silence before the chains. For 3 days, Rome did not attack. For 3 days, the gates of Corinth stood open. And inside the city, the women began to understand that silence can be more terrifying than war. On the 3rd morning after the battle at the Isthmus, Thea stood at the upper window of her home overlooking the agora and watched smoke coil into a sky stained the color of bruised iron. Beyond the walls, across the narrow strip of land that made Corinth rich beyond measure, 23,000 Roman soldiers waited in disciplined stillness. They were not shouting, they were not charging, they were simply there, polished helmets flashing in the rising sun, shields stacked in patient rows like merchants preparing to collect a debt that could no longer be negotiated. Thea was 34 years old, wife of a councilman who had voted against every Roman peace offer and marched out with confidence 3 days earlier. He had not returned. Down below, the city that once pulsed with traders from Alexandria, Sicily, and Massilia lay abandoned to the wind, its market stalls overturned, its bronze weights scattered in dust where fortunes used to change hands before noon. Corinth had always been noise, arguments, bargaining, the rattle of wagons dragged across the Diolkos, the scent of dye vats and imported perfume colliding in humid air. Now there was only the thin cry of a stray dog and the creak of shutters moving in the breeze. The looting had begun before the Romans ever stepped through the gates. Freed slaves, dock workers, men who had not fought, had broken into wealthy homes the first night after the defeat, stripping storehouses of oil and grain, prying silver cups from dining rooms where diplomats once drank watered wine beneath painted ceilings. Thea's daughters had hidden behind a false cellar wall built years ago against pirates, clutching each other while footsteps pounded overhead. No Roman sword had yet touched Corinth, but fear had already fractured its order. When word spread that the Achaean cavalry had scattered and the general fled south, poisoning his own wife rather than leave her for Rome, the calculation became clear to every woman in the city. If a commander chose death for his household over Roman mercy, what did that mercy look like? Corinth had been more than wealthy, it had been visible. Its women wore gold at the Isthmian Games, dedicated offerings atop the Corinth, and managed commercial estates that moved goods between two seas. Their identities were fused to a city whose name carried weight in every port from Athens to Carthage. That belief, that status meant protection, that ritual devotion meant favor from the gods, began to rot in those 3 waiting days. The temple of Aphrodite still crowned the limestone summit above them, but no smoke rose from sacrificial fires there. Even the sacred seemed uncertain. Rome's delay was not mercy, it was calculation. The consul Lucius Mummius feared an ambush, and so he let dread ferment inside the walls. Mothers gathered in clusters near wells and temples, whispering about escape routes that no longer existed. Some fled before dawn, slipping toward mountain paths with jewelry sewn into hems. Most stayed. They cared for wounded men who staggered back from the battlefield, shared bread scraped from near-empty jars, and watched the horizon where Roman standards cut against the sky. In those hours, the last functioning authority in Corinth was not its council or its generals, but its women, organizing, feeding, praying, and pretending their world still held shape. Then, just as the sun reached its height on the 3rd day, the Roman formations began to move. Shields lifted in unison, columns tightened. The waiting was over. And what came through those gates would not be chaos, it would be system. The city becomes inventory. Rome did not storm Corinth in rage. It entered like an accountant opening a ledger. And every woman inside those walls became a number waiting to be written down. When Lucius Mummius marched through the gates, he did not find barricades or ambushes. He found a city already hollowed by fear. Roman soldiers moved in tight formation, shields angled, swords drawn not in frenzy, but in expectation. They advanced street by street, kicking open doors, dragging survivors into daylight, stacking valuables at designated collection points with the detached efficiency of men who had performed this ritual before. For the Republic, a conquered city was not merely defeated territory, it was liquid capital. Gold was weighed, statues were catalogued, and human beings were sorted. The system was honed by decades of expansion across Spain, Macedonia, and Epirus, and it operated with chilling precision. Military-aged men were cut down without debate, their bodies left in courtyards or dragged into piles. The elderly who could not stand were dispatched quickly. Women and children were separated, gathered, counted, not mourned, counted. Thea felt hands seize her arms and pull her from the doorway where she had been shielding her daughters. A soldier spoke Latin she did not understand, but the meaning required no translation. In the agora, thousands were herded into the open space where merchants once traded purple dye and bronze lamps. Now the same square functioned as a holding pen beneath Roman supervision. Mothers clutched infants, while officers observed, calculating value in silence. Roman warfare was built upon profit as much as power. Captives were assets, and assets required classification. The scribes began marking rough tallies on wax tablets, age estimates, visible skills, signs of literacy, posture suggesting education. A Greek woman who carried herself with dignity could fetch a higher price than one who looked broken. Among those gathered were priestesses from the sanctuary atop the Corinth, women who had served Aphrodite and Demeter, custodians of rites older than Rome itself. Their sacred roles dissolved in an instant. Temple dedication did not shield them, it merely added novelty to their sale. In Roman markets, exotic religious knowledge could increase a buyer's interest. A woman trained in ritual song or versed in sacred customs might be marketed as refined, cultured, rare. The same faith that once elevated them above ordinary households now sharpened their desirability as commodities. Rome did not erase tradition, it repurposed it. The separation began quietly but decisively. Children deemed old enough to survive alone were pulled from their mothers and grouped by height and health. Investment logic governed the process. A 9-year-old girl could be trained and resold at profit. A 12-year-old nearing maturity might command immediate demand. Tears did not interrupt procedure. Roman soldiers had been instructed clearly. Resistance meant death. Compliance meant survival, at least temporarily. That thin promise kept panic contained. As the sun dipped, the first auctions were prepared near the Roman camp beyond the walls. A spear was driven upright into the earth, the symbol of sale under military authority. Professional slave traders who followed legions across continents stepped forward to inspect the human spoils. Corinth, once mistress of 2 seas, had become inventory beneath a single standard. And as the first bids were whispered, a realization spread through the captives like frost. Rome had not come to punish a city, it had come to dismantle it, piece by piece, until nothing remained but profit. The auction under the spear. A single spear stood upright in the soil outside Corinth. It did not symbolize war anymore. It marked the place where lives would be priced, raised, and taken away. By the 4th morning, the smoke drifting above Corinth no longer came from battle, but from controlled fires set by Roman engineers clearing sections of the city. Order had replaced chaos, and beneath that order stood the spear, planted firmly in the earth near the Roman camp, the ancient signal that a public auction was underway. The phrase was venditio sub hasta, a sale under the spear, and it was as familiar to Rome as triumphal parades. Professional slave traders moved through the lines of captives with the same cold detachment livestock buyers used in provincial markets. They pressed fingers against arms to test muscle, tilted chins to inspect teeth, asked translators about origin, skill, literacy. Corinthian accents were noted. Education mattered. A woman who could read Greek, manage accounts, or play a lyre held a different market value than one raised in rural obscurity. Rome did not erase culture, it monetized it. Thea stood in a row of women whose clothing still marked them as wives of wealth. Though dust-streaked and stripped of jewelry, their posture betrayed their upbringing. Buyers saw refinement in the way they carried themselves. One trader asked whether she could write. Another inquired about her experience managing servants. Every answer increased interest, and interest increased bidding tension. To the Romans, this was commerce, not cruelty. The Republic's wars financed themselves through these transactions. Captives funded legions, legions expanded territory, territory produced more captives. The cycle was efficient, rational, devastating. Nearby, children were separated into smaller groups. Thea's daughters, once sheltered behind a cellar wall, now stood beneath open sky with wooden tags hung loosely from cords around their necks. Each tag bore crude markings noting age and apparent health. The 9-year-old tried to hold her sister's hand, but guards pulled them apart for assessment. Traders believed selling siblings separately generated higher profit. Individual sales meant multiple buyers, multiple bids. A Roman investor purchasing a young Greek girl saw potential decades of domestic service or resale at maturity. It was not personal, it was arithmetic. Among the captives were women from the temple on the Corinth, their sacred hair coverings removed, their identities reduced to descriptors: trained singer, ritual attendant, literate. Buyers murmured about novelty. Some whispered of hosting Greek ceremonies in private villas, eager to possess fragments of conquered sophistication. The irony was grotesque. Rome had crushed Corinth's independence, yet coveted its culture, its art, its refinement. The same soldiers who tossed painted panels onto the dirt for dice games now guarded women whose upbringing represented the civilization those paintings once celebrated. The bidding began without fanfare. Numbers were called in Latin, repeated in Greek by intermediaries. A nod here, a raised hand there. Contracts were sealed quickly. Captives were transferred in clusters, chains replacing rope, rope replacing human connection. Thea heard a final bid echo over the murmurs and felt her daughter's fingers slip from her grasp as a trader pulled the girl toward a waiting group bound for transport. There was no dramatic cry, no riot, only a ledger mark confirming purchase. Corinth, once master of 2 harbors, had become merchandise dispersed in lots. And as the sun dipped beyond the isthmus, the first ships prepared to carry the city's women toward a destination that would erase their names from history. The island that swallowed cities. There was an island where thousands vanished before sunset. No walls, no temples, no memories, only speed. If Corinth was broken in war, Delos finished the erasure. The ships carrying Corinth's women did not sail toward Rome immediately. They sailed east to Delos, the Aegean island that had become the busiest slave market in the Mediterranean. Strabo would later write that 10,000 people could be bought and sold there in a single day, and the traders who docked with Corinthian captives moved with that expectation. The harbor was a blur of masts and shouting in multiple languages, chains clanking against planks, clerks tallying human cargo as though inventory were arriving from a quarry. Delos did not ask who these women had been. It asked only how quickly they could be transferred to new owners. The system prized velocity. A delay meant cost, and Corinth's destruction had produced supply in abundance. Thea felt the deck shift beneath her feet as she and dozens of others were herded down a gangplank into a marketplace that smelled of salt, sweat, and olive oil burning in shallow lamps. Traders wasted no time. They reclassified their purchases, breaking apart bulk lots to maximize individual value. On Delos, identity dissolved faster than grief. A Corinthian wife became educated Greek female, mid-30s. A temple attendant became trained ritual servant, healthy. Children were positioned near the front of the display platforms, where buyers preferred to inspect them under direct light. No one asked about husbands left behind in ash or the council seats once occupied in marble halls. That currency had expired. The island's architecture amplified the spectacle. Porticos lined the market square, casting hard shadows that sharpened the outlines of bodies on raised blocks. Buyers from Italy, Asia Minor, and North Africa examined wrists and shoulders, asking about musical skill or household management, the way investors asked about land fertility. Greek literacy was a selling point. Rome admired what it conquered, and wealthy Roman households coveted Greek tutors and domestics who carried refinement. The tragedy was layered with irony. Corinth's women had once helped manage trade that passed through this same sea. Now they were the cargo being optimized. Among the crowd stood a Roman landowner from Campania who had heard rumors about Corinthian temple customs. He did not seek a laborer. He sought prestige. Owning a woman trained in sacred rites would elevate dinner conversations in his villa, proof that he possessed not just wealth, but fragments of a defeated civilization's mystique. To him, religion was aesthetic, culture ornamental. To the woman he inspected, it had once been devotion. That gulf could not be bridged. As transactions concluded, captives were marked again, assigned to new ships heading west. Delos did not linger on sorrow, it processed it. By dusk, entire groups had disappeared into holds bound for Italy, Sicily, or distant estates along the Tiber. Corinth's women, once visible in temples and festivals, were now dispersed threads in Rome's expanding fabric. The island had done what war alone could not. It stripped continuity. And as the last Corinthian voices faded into the harbor noise, one question remained unspoken yet unavoidable. What happens when an empire conquers so thoroughly that it begins consuming the very culture it claims to admire? Triumph and the hidden cost. Rome celebrated victory in sunlight, but the shadows behind the procession carried something darker. Corinth's defeat did not end at the harbor. It marched straight into the heart of the Republic. When Lucius Mummius returned to Rome, he did not come alone. He brought a spectacle. Ships unloaded statues, bronzes, painted panels, and crates filled with objects that once defined Corinthian identity. The Senate approved a triumph, and citizens crowded the streets to watch trophies roll past in organized splendor. To the Roman public, it was proof of dominance. Greece subdued, resistance extinguished, commerce redirected toward Roman hands. But beneath the glittering procession was a quieter transfer of power. Greek art entered Roman villas. Greek tutors entered Roman households, and Greek women, wives, daughters, priestesses, entered domestic service across Italy, reshaping the culture of the very society that had conquered them. The Republic believed it was asserting control. In truth, it was absorbing influence. Roman elites, long suspicious of Greek softness, now competed to display Greek refinement. Owning a Corinthian domestic signaled sophistication. Banquets featured Greek music. Private shrines incorporated elements borrowed from temples that no longer stood. What had been plunder slowly became fashion. And yet, for the women who embodied that culture, there was no transformation into prestige, only adaptation to survival. Thea, now in a household outside Capua, managed accounts for a Roman matron who valued her literacy but never spoke her name correctly. Her daughters were elsewhere, separated by the arithmetic of profit. Rome's triumph did not reunite families, it redistributed them. Mummius himself reportedly confessed that if transport ships lost any looted artwork, replacements of equal value must be provided, revealing a chilling misunderstanding of uniqueness. To him, art could be replaced, culture could be replicated. That mindset extended to people. The Republic treated human lives as renewable assets. Yet beneath this efficiency lay insecurity. Rome's rapid expansion bred anxiety among its leaders, fear that Greek philosophy, luxury, and ritual might soften Roman virtue. So laws were passed limiting excess, even as elite families privately indulged in the very spoils they publicly criticized. The contradiction deepened. Whispers circulated among conservative senators that Rome had gone too far, not morally but culturally. By destroying Corinth, the Republic had silenced a rival, but it had also unleashed a flood of Hellenistic influence into Roman society. The conqueror found itself challenged by what it consumed. Greek language became fashionable among the educated. Greek teachers shaped the minds of Roman sons. Greek religious customs appeared in private ceremonies. The empire had crushed a city, yet fragments of that city now lived in the homes of its victors. And still, Beyond the marble facades of Roman villas, thousands of Corinthian women labored in obscurity, their stories unrecorded, their resilience invisible. The triumph ended in applause, but the transformation it triggered continued quietly, reshaping Rome from within. Victory had been absolute on the battlefield, but in absorbing the conquered, Rome planted seeds it did not fully understand. And history would later ask whether the greatest danger to an empire is the enemy it defeats or the culture it decides to own. Ashes that refused to disappear. Corinth burned. Its women vanished into ledgers and households. But some ruins do not stay silent, they wait. Years after the sack, travelers walked across a plain where Corinth once commanded 2 seas, and what they found was not merely destruction, but absence. Temples stood roofless, columns cast long shadows over foundations stripped of color. The Acro-Corinth still rose like a clenched fist above the landscape, yet its sanctuaries were hollow, their sacred fires long extinguished. Rome had not just defeated a rival, it had erased a system of meaning. The markets that once pulsed with bargaining voices were silent. The Diolkos, that ingenious stone road that carried ships across land, lay unused. And beneath the silence lingered a truth too vast for triumphal speeches. The city's women had not died in battle, they had been scattered into anonymity. In Italy, Sicily, and beyond, Corinthian captives adjusted to lives imposed upon them. Some gained positions of trust in Roman households, their literacy and refinement valued even if their origins were ignored. Others labored invisibly in kitchens, workshops, and estates, where their children grew up speaking Latin instead of Greek. Over time, identities blurred. A Roman child educated by a former Corinthian priestess might quote Homer without ever knowing the woman who taught him once stood atop the Acro-Corinth, praying for a city now reduced to ash. The conqueror absorbed the conquered so completely that memory itself thinned. Historians like Polybius recorded the spectacle of burning cities and looted art, yet even he struggled to capture the scale of human dislocation. Tens of thousands dispersed through slave routes left almost no written trace. They became statistics in military reports, footnotes in economic studies, nameless figures in trade accounts, and yet their influence endured. Greek customs filtered into Roman religion. Greek aesthetics reshaped Roman architecture. Greek intellectual traditions molded Roman thought. Rome believed it had asserted dominance, but in absorbing Corinth, it invited transformation. That irony lingers in the ruins. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered fragments, a bronze statue salvaged from a shipwreck, a shattered inscription referencing a dedication by a Corinthian woman, traces of homes abruptly abandoned. Each artifact hints at lives interrupted, at relationships severed mid-sentence. They remind us that conquest does not simply redraw borders, it dismantles networks of belief and belonging. The women of Corinth were processed through a system designed for efficiency, yet systems cannot fully extinguish memory. Cultural influence seeps through cracks in empire. The shocking truth is not merely that Rome destroyed Corinth, or that its women were sold under a spear. It is that Rome's greatest victory carried within it the seeds of change that would reshape the republic itself. By turning people into profit, Rome accelerated its own transformation from austere republic to empire steeped in the luxuries it once claimed to despise. Corinth's destruction became both warning and catalyst. Today, visitors stand among Corinth's ruins and see stones, but beneath those stones lies a quieter reckoning. Empires measure success in territory and wealth. History measures it in consequence. Corinth fell in 146 BCE, its women scattered beyond recovery. Yet the culture Rome tried to own would one day eclipse Roman identity itself. And that is the final echo of the story. When an empire goes too far, it may win the war, but it never controls what survives it.